Right, so without any further ado, since time is short, I will, of course, thank the organizers and everyone for being here. As you may know, I'm not a Tractatus person, first Wittgenstein person. I've mostly worked on uncertainty. And that explains something about what I'm about to say. First, that whatever I'm going to say regarding the Tractatus, but also uncertainty in this case, is very tentative. And second, that my interest in this passage in the Tractatus, so one cannot say there are objects as one says there are books, was originally prompted by reading actually something like the very same phrase in uncertainty, and then wondering whether Wittgenstein had continuously had the same view regarding there are objects, or whether behind the same signs there are objects. Actually, the meaning of that and the reasons why he says both in the Tractatus and in Uncertainty that it would be nonsense to say there are objects ultimately were different. And then just to explain why Carnap is included here, this year I was teaching a graduate seminar on various conceptions of philosophy, and of course we were talking about Wittgenstein's conception, the neo-positivist conception, and so on. And it turns out that in a famous paper by Carnap, in which he distinguishes between internal and external questions and raises the problem of what it means to assert the existence of objects, he makes a curious historical remark towards the end, and he attributes to Wittgenstein, or at least the paternity to some extent of the ideas that he's putting forward in that very paper. And I was struck by that historical remark, and here I would like to assess with you the accuracy of this attribution by Carnap of the genesis of his own ideas to the Tractatus, as I think is the only option available for chronological reasons. All right, with that being said, let's start with the Tractatus. Now, in the context of that passage, which is part of my title, is the following one: that anything falls under formal concepts, and here by formal concepts Wittgenstein has in mind concept, object, number, and so on. So that anything falls under formal concepts as an object belonging to it cannot be expressed by a proposition, but it shows itself in the sign of this object itself. For instance, the name, in a correct logical symbolism, shows that it signifies an object, the numerical sign that it signifies a number, etc. The point is that formal concepts like object or number cannot, contrary to proper concepts, be presented in a correct symbolism by a function. Their characteristics, the formal properties, are not expressed by the functions. The expression of a formal property is a feature of certain symbols. The signs that signifies the characteristic of a formal concept is a characteristic feature of all symbols whose meanings, Bedeutung, Bedeutungen, that is reference, fall under that concept. So the expression of the formal concept, writes Wittgenstein, is a proposition of variable in which only this characteristic feature, for instance, the variable for objects is that of being arguments of functions. So every variable in a correct symbolism is the sign of a formal concept. And then he gives the example: the variable name X is the proper sign of the pseudo-concept. Now he no longer calls it formal concept, but pseudo-concept object. And he adds, wherever the word object, thing, entity is rightly used, it is expressed in logical symbolism by the variable name. And then he gives an example: there are two objects, should be written by, but should be symbolized by there is an X and there is a Y such that. And finally, adds, wherever it is used otherwise, as a proper concept word, so if we thought of object as a function, there arise senseless, but notice that the German here is unsinnig, pseudo-propositions. And then comes the quote that is part of my title. So one cannot say there are objects as one says there are books, and the same for there are 100 objects, an infinite number of objects, and so on. They all signify formal concepts and are presented in logical symbolism by variables. So we need to have enough variables to symbolize these formal concepts. They are not symbolized by functions or classes, and then it takes issue with Frege and Russell. I don't want to go into that. I don't want to look at whether that taking issue with Frege and Russell is correct. Now, the question about the existence of a formal concept, he writes, is senseless, again, unsinnig, for no proposition can answer such a question. And why is that? Well, because we cannot even write anything that could mean, in a correct symbolism, there are objects, or indeed its negation. Think, for instance, of the kind of reading of existential statements that Frege put forward. According to Frege, we can write that there are books, for instance, or at least one book in the universe, or indeed in my study, and we do that by writing the following formula on the top of the screen. There is an X such as that X is F, where F is the concept, is a book, and there is an object equals to X. So what that means for Frege, however, is not an existential statement regarding an object, is rather a statement about the concept being a book. And what that phrase says is that the concept of being a book isn't empty, or in other words, it is instantiated. Now, the point Wittgenstein is making here in the passages that we have looked at is that in a correct symbolism, we cannot replace F with O, where O is an object, into a formula like the one on top of the screen. So we cannot say, because we cannot correctly compose those symbols together, or put them together, O of X or O of A. And therefore, we cannot say or write the existential statement. So there are very specific reasons why Wittgenstein says that we cannot say that much, and no proposition about the existence of objects can be formulated within the very strict rules, as it were, that the correct symbolism should have for them. Now, notice, however, that another passage in the same whereabouts, he writes, the formal concept is already given with an object which falls under it. And I think this is a very important point, and I like the image here of the dice and rolling the dice. The idea, I take it, is that by being given the objects as if we were to roll the dice, we are already given the formal concept of an object. And that's why he thinks that one cannot introduce the two things separately as primitive ideas, as the quote shows in the remaining. So notice also that in the Tractatus, Wittgenstein, as we were seeing a few talks ago, or maybe in the questions, says that objects are the substance of the word. And he also thinks that they must exist for our language to have meaning. If there weren't objects, then the elements of the language could not have a meaning, could not fulfill their representational function. So by being given the objects, according to what we have just seen in the previous quote, we are also given the formal concepts, for instance, the formal concept of object. So the existence of objects is shown in the logical symbolism by the existence of appropriate variables and names. So what I take to be the take-home message here is that there is an ontology in the Tractatus And once we are given the objects, we are also given the formal concepts. In a correct symbolism, we cannot say that much. No such formula like the previous ones that we saw can be written meaningfully in the symbolism, but yet the existence of objects is shown by there being appropriate variables and also names and constants in a sense. All right, so that's what I think Wittgenstein is roughly saying in the Tractatus. In the philosophical investigations, things start changing. Here I have a long quote that for reasons of time I'm not going to read. It's a famous one about ostensive definitions, and the moral of the quote is that an ostensive definition can be variously interpreted in any case. So famously, you can, we start interpreting the ostensive definition by looking in the direction of the finger. But, if we were different kinds of animals, for instance, you can't do that with a dog, we would be looking probably in the direction of the wrist. What is the point and what's the relevance of this quote in the context of what I was saying about there are objects? Well, the first thing that seems to be retracted is the idea that by being given objects, by being shown ostensibly certain objects, we are given the formal concepts. It's not already a given, as it were, in the act of ostension. In fact, the quote shows that when we try to define ostensibly, for instance, the number 2, or even in the name of a person, then by showing the group of 2 objects or a person, we might be understanding those things in very different ways, like a person's name or the name of a color. Think of those people that have as a last name White, or even of a race, or even of a point of a compass. I'm not sure what Wittgenstein was thinking there. The second quote that I have from the philosophical investigations is the famous one about the standard meter in Paris. And you all know how it goes. There is one thing of which one can say neither that is 1 meter long, nor that it is not 1 meter long, and that is the standard meter in Paris. But this, of course, is not to ascribe any extraordinary property to it, but only to mark its peculiar role in the language game of measuring with the meter rule. It is not something that is represented, but it is a means of representation. So the point, as we all know, is that we are not ascribing the property to the meter, to the bar of being 1 meter long. Rather, we are subsuming that bar, that object, into the language as a means of representation, and then we utilize to do several things, like measuring objects in our environments. So the quote continues, this gives this object a role in our language game. It is now a means of representation. And now, modulating this on the issue of existence and of the necessary existence of objects, that, as you remember, is a tenet in the Tractatus, Wittgenstein adds, if it did not exist, it could have no name, is to say as much and as little as, if this thing did not exist, we could not use it in our language game. Of course, if it didn't exist, we couldn't use that bar as a means of representation, for instance, to compare it with objects to determine their length. And then he continues, what looks as if it had to exist, so we are here talking about the necessary existence of at least one object, is part of the language. It is a paradigm in our language game, something with which comparison is made. And this may be an important observation, but it is nonetheless an observation concerning our language game, our method of representation. So clearly Wittgenstein here, of course, is denying a strong ontological reading, is denying the idea that objects have necessarily to exist in order for language to have meaning that he had in the Tractatus. He's saying, look, sometimes we incorporate in the language what we would consider objects, and they become means of representation by means of which we do certain things. We play certain language games like measuring objects. So just to sum up, formal concepts aren't given with the objects. Objects that are used in ostensive definitions are instruments in our language. No ontological claim follows from noting this much, let alone the necessary existence of object. What follows is only something about our language, namely that we have within the language certain objects, paradigms of colors, etc., that we use for certain purposes. Now, here we come to uncertainty. And there are only 3 passages in uncertainty in which Wittgenstein addresses the issue head-on. And they are very early passages, and we all know that there are many problems concerning the composition of uncertainty. I'm not going to say anything about that. So here are the passages. But can't it be imagined that there should be no physical objects? I don't know. And yet there are physical objects is nonsense. Notice here that the word is Unsinn. It's the same one as in the Tractatus, but the translations in English are different. Is it supposed to be an empirical proposition? Something that we would ascertain by looking, for instance? Clearly the invited answer is no. And is this an empirical proposition? There seem to be physical objects. Again, the invited answer is not. Now, here comes the relevant passage at 36. A is a physical object, is a piece of instruction which we give only to someone who doesn't yet understand either what A means or what physical object means. So the relevant point here is that contrary to the Tractatus, for Wittgenstein, we can say A is a physical object, but of course this is not to say that we are attributing the property of being a physical object to that entity. Rather, we are giving a piece of instruction about the expression physical object. For instance, by pointing to something like this, like a pen, and say, oh, this is a physical object. And we do that in a certain context, namely when a person, for instance, doesn't yet understand the locution physical object, and we are trying to explain ostensibly or even define what that means. So this is an instruction about the use of words, and physical object is a logical concept like color, quantity, etc. Now he calls it logical concept instead of formal concept, but I think he's still dealing with the same kind of concepts or pseudo concepts, as he also calls them in the Tractatus. And that is why no such proposition as there are physical objects can be formulated. Then there is this little coda that we will see in a moment, yet we encounter such unsuccessful shots at every turn. So just to get to some moral here, I think that in uncertainty, A as physical object can be said, contrary to what Wittgenstein said in the Tractatus. Still, it could not be represented as saying that there is a function O under which an entity falls. At most, it would be a piece of instruction about our means of representation. But what kind of instruction, really? And this is my tentative interpretation of what Wittgenstein is driving at in that passage. And notice that, it's certainly tentative, also because Wittgenstein doesn't say much about, or indeed anything else about how to understand this piece of instruction. I think that one possible reading is to say that we are trying to impart at least certain an understanding of the kind of inferences that are licensed by saying that this is a physical object. For instance, it is licensed to conclude that this object continues to exist even if I'm not now perceiving it. Whereas it's not licensed to conclude that it might no longer be there wherever I put it in a drawer, for instance, because we are not perceiving it. Or it's possible, just because we are not perceiving, that it might not be there anymore. Now, in uncertainty, like in the Tractatus, we cannot say there are physical objects, because we cannot give an ontological reading of it, as if affirming the existence of these particular kinds of entity. nor can we give the semantic reading, because we cannot write that relevant formula, as it were, because object is not like, or being an object is not a function. But as we saw in the Tractatus, objects could be shown or given. That was part of their being an ontology, and indeed a necessary one for meaning to be possible. And by being given the objects, we were also given the formal concept object. None of that remains in the Tractate, in uncertainty, I think, for reasons that we have at least scratched. Now, I said before that the coda is interesting because it says that we find these unsuccessful shots at every turn. And where do we find these unsuccessful shots? Where? When we are dealing with philosophers. Is it an adequate answer to the skepticism of the idealist or the assurances of the realist to say that there are physical objects is nonsense? For them, after all, it's not nonsense. But it would be an answer to say this assertion or its opposite is a misfiring attempt to express what cannot be expressed like that. And what is it that one might try to express like that, but should not be expressed like that? Probably, that's my hunch, what I said before, namely that according to the realist language, certain inferences are licensed by the word or the expression physical object, whereas according to the idealist language, as we might call it, these inferences are not. And there are also some methods of verification that go with different understandings of physical objects here, but I'm not going to go into that. So I take that to be the moral in those passages. And so realists and idealists are neither affirming or denying the existence of physical objects, even though they understand themselves as doing that. That would be the ontological reading, that for Wittgenstein is incorrect. Nor are they affirming or denying that the concept of physical object is empty. That would be the semantic reading, and that again is not even a possibility for him. Rather, we should take them as disputing over which inferences we are licensed to draw. And this is a dispute ultimately about which language we should speak. And very tentatively, and in air quotes, I put here the meta-linguistic reading because obviously I know full well that for Wittgenstein there is no distinction between language and meta-language, but that's the kind of reading that after Carnap, as we will see in a moment, has become known as the meta-linguistic reading, and I think there are elements in common. If you don't like meta-linguistic in this context, fine, call it the linguistic or inferentialist reading, I'm fine with that. So, Carnap. Carnap in empiricism, semantics, and ontology, which, let me draw your attention to the chronology here, was published in 1950. And remember that Uncertainty was written, certainly not published, in between 1949 and 1951. So we are contemporary. In empiricism, semantics, and ontology, Carnap talks about the world of things. He distinguishes between frameworks and the universe of discourse within a given framework. And he also distinguishes between internal and external questions. So we can ask internal questions. Are there books in this room? Once we already have an ontology of things, or better, a thing language, and we have means to ascertain that much, but then we may sometimes ask also questions that are external questions about the framework. So we may ask, are there physical objects? And notice that Carnap clearly says that we must distinguish these external questions and internal question. The external question regarding the existence or of things, of objects, is neither raised by the man in the street nor by scientists, but only by philosophers, like Wittgenstein was, in a sense, suggesting already. Realists give an affirmative answer, subjective idealists a negative one, and the controversy goes on for centuries without ever being solved. But there is a reason to that for Carnap. It cannot be solved because the question is framed in a wrong way. Why is it framed in a wrong way? Because they take that to be a theoretical question, but it's rather a practical question, a matter of practical decision concerning the structure of our language. We have to make the choice whether or not to accept and use the forms of expression of the framework in question. Of course, Carnap is much more of a conventionalist than Wittgenstein. He also notices that it comes natural to us, for various reasons that I have no time to explore here, to use the thing language. Nevertheless, he adds, we may regard it as a matter of decision in this sense. We are free to choose to continue using the thing language or not. In the latter case, we could restrict ourselves to a language of sense data and other phenomenal entities, and then he gives some other options, and then he says we could refrain from speaking, which would be maybe not very useful, or would have some problems anyway. So the point here is that for Carnap, we are at liberty to choose to continue to speak this language or not. This I don't think is an element that we find in Wittgenstein at all. And then he also says to accept the thing word means nothing more than to accept a certain form of language. In other words, to accept rules for forming statements and for testing, accepting, or rejecting them. And of course, being the pragmatist that he is, he also says the efficiency, the fruitfulness, and simplicity of the use of the thing language may be among the decisive factors in making us choose to continue to speak that language rather than switch to a different one. I don't think this pragmatism is present in Wittgenstein's remarks in uncertainty. And here comes the brief historical remark, as Carnap himself calls it. He says, the non-cognitive character of the questions, which we have called here external questions, was recognized and emphasized already by the Vienna Circle under the leadership of Moritz Schlick. Okay, so far so good. And then there is this final part to the remark. Influenced by ideas of Ludwig Wittgenstein, the Circle rejected both the thesis of the reality of the external world and the thesis of its irreality as pseudo-statements. Now, what I find puzzling in this historical remark is that I drew your attention to the dates here, to the chronology. Carnap publishes this paper in 1950. Wittgenstein is writing the remarks that are part of uncertainty in the same years. I don't think there was a contact between the two of them at that point. And notoriously, the Wittgenstein that was more present and relevant to the Vienna Circle was definitely the Tractatus. But for what I've said in the beginning, in the Tractatus, we don't find anything like this kind of pragmatic reading of the question, are there physical objects? Just summing up, both in the Tractatus and in Uncertainty, Wittgenstein arrived at a similar conclusion concerning the statement, there are physical objects. It cannot be said in either of these works of his. But the reasons for that are entirely different. And so it seems to me that what follows from that is that this sort of metalinguistic turn, if we want to allow ourselves to speak that way, is not present in Wittgenstein the Tractatus. It comes much later. And if we want to read Carnap's remark, then it seems to be, in a sense, historically inadequate, because the TLP, the Tractatus, cannot be at the origins of the metalinguistic turn that Carnap and Ali and other people took for obvious chronological reasons. So that's it. Thank you.